In this challenge, we need to now trigger the second sphere. And when the second sphere hits the ground, it's going to turn red and trigger the third sphere. So right now we know when to trigger the sphere. It's during the collision event, which happens inside of our floor script. So what needs to happen right here? We just turned the sphere red, and somehow we need to trigger the next sphere. Well, how do we go about doing that? Our floor doesn't know about any of the next spheres, and we could define the next sphere here in the floor and communicate with it, but that's not really the purpose of the floor. The floor is simply just to detect collisions, and we should maintain its entire scope to do just that. Instead, what if we communicated back to the game manager and said, drop the next one? And somehow it would just know, okay, drop sphere 2 or drop sphere 3. We could even define functions for it. So for example, inside of the game manager here, we know that, okay, cool. What if we had a function that was here that allowed us to just call into, let's say, define a function to drop the next sphere. And when we call that function, it will just know to somehow drop sphere 2. And then when we call that function again, it's then going to drop sphere 3. How could it possibly know that? And what does it look like to communicate there? How do we communicate there? In order to do that, we have to store a reference, which means a handle. We need to define a reference to the game manager in our floor script. And then here, trigger the next sphere, we're going to access the game manager and call the function called drop the next sphere. And that's going to be called from the floor. So when I call drop the next sphere, somehow the game manager is going to know, define a function to drop the next sphere. It's going to know that, okay, cool, I'm going to drop sphere 2 now, and then sphere 3. And we have to think about, what if I had 6 spheres, if 7 spheres? Am I going to have 7 variables? Does it make sense to define all of our spheres like this and change that to 2, and then like this and change it to 3? And imagine I had 60 spheres. It doesn't. So what we need to do is actually turn this into an array. Because if we store an array of spheres, one, we can have an infinite amount of spheres in our collection, but then here, we can define a function to drop the next sphere. We can maintain an iterator that says current sphere to drop. And at the start, when sphere 1 is not null, then we're going to increment that value essentially. Or if sphere sub 0 is not null, we're going to increment. And then we can define a function that's going to drop the next sphere, and it's just going to know, okay, cool, underscore sphere 1 or 2 or 3, we can define an index to know the current drop, essentially. So really try and think about this. I'll see you in the challenge review.